Hello everyone, welcome to this Conservation Optimism webinar, Bridging Borders, Crafting Inclusive Communications for Wildlife Conservation. We will be starting shortly in 1 more minute. Okay, I think we are good to start. Um, so as our webinar topic is all about communications, what is effective and inclusive communication? It is said that effective communication is 20% of what we know and 80% of how we feel about what we know. It is tricky, of course, but it is even more trickier in conservation because we have to deal with diverse cultural background. We have limited resources and there is a limited time for urgent call to action. I'm really excited to learn all these things in today's webinar, but let me first quickly introduce myself and our team. And in the meantime, I can already see that you have introduced yourself, so thank you so much. My name is Resu Basel. I am Community Manager at Conservation Optimism. And we have John Taylor, Director of Conservation Optimism, and Holly Thompson, Project Assistant of Conservation Optimism. And of course, we have our today's webinar host, Mireia Peris, who is a Communications and Marketing Coordinator at MarAlliance. In today's webinar, Mireia will talk about inclusive communications, and we will learn about practical approaches to ensure effective and inclusive messaging. Before I hand over this platform to Mireia, a quick heads up. This webinar is being recorded. That means you can also watch this webinar later on in our YouTube channel. Please mute yourself. I don't have to say this, but just thought to mention. There is a Q&A session where you have plenty of opportunity to ask questions to Maria. So get ready with lots of questions. And we have a special announcement regarding Conservation Optimism Summit. So stay tuned for that. All right, without further ado, I want to hand over this platform to Maria.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, the Conservation Optimism team, for allowing me to host another webinar for your community. And thank you, everyone who's joining us today. As Reshu mentioned, my name is Mireia Peris, and I'm the Communications and Marketing Coordinator of MarAlliance. MarAlliance is a non-profit organization, and we do research and promote the conservation of large marine megafauna species and their habitats by engaging and empowering local communities and stakeholders. So, next slide, please. I'm going to introduce myself. I've been working for more than 9 years now in the communications and marketing departments of different charities and organizations in the conservation and sustainability sector. I've done both online and offline campaigns, event management, crisis management, and I'm very passionate about conservation and community engagement because I think that's the only way that we can actually thrive and make the world a better place for everyone. So basically today what I'm going to do is we're going to have this workshop. It's going to be the first part is a bit of the theory, and then I'm going to explain some examples that I've co-managed or that I like and I believe that are a good example of inclusive communications. And then we'll have the Q&A session. So if you want to write your questions down, we can discuss them at the end of the workshop. Next slide, please. So the first thing I think that as communicators we need to ask ourselves is, why is it important? Why do we need to think about tailoring inclusive communication materials or doing inclusive campaigns? and what is the importance of a multilingual and cultural inclusive communication asset. So I think that the first thing is the accessibility and engagement. When we do inclusive materials, we ensure that the campaign resonates with many different audiences and that everyone feels part of it and can understand it, and this increases the participation. Then we also ensure we showcase local culture and tradition to broader audiences that might not be aware of what's going on in the region where we're working, or that helps them understand the different ways of life and the different cultures that we can find in a place and how that's related to the conservation projects we're working on. And then we also build trust and strong relationships, because when we do culturally relevant communications, besides fostering trust and cooperation with the local communities and the local stakeholders, we also build trust with our funders, our other collaborators, our partners, etc. Next slide, please. So what are the main challenges that from a communications perspective? So basically what we're going to see now in the slide is the main challenges that I've faced when thinking about the strategy or the different actions to create inclusive communications, because obviously sometimes we work in remote teams, or we have team members in the field, or we work with people from different backgrounds and different cultures, so we might find different ways of thinking, different ways of expressing emotions, and all of this needs to be also taken into account. So, as I was saying, these would be like the five more obvious challenges that I faced. And one would be the emotional barriers. As I was mentioning, sometimes there's cultural difference in expressing emotions, feelings, differing beliefs, etc. Then we have the physical barriers, which can be geographical or infrastructural. As I was mentioning, maybe you're a part of a remote or an international team, and as the communicator, you need to communicate things that are happening in Latin America or in Europe, and you're based in the US. So there's like an obvious physical barrier. Cultural barriers, which means that sometimes in some places or some regions, you can find like different traditions and societal roles that influence communications and the way people understand what we're doing there, the conservation project we are doing, and we need to try and be as inclusive as possible to ensure that we're all in the same page. Obviously, language barriers, we might experience translation issues or languages we don't speak, dialects, or even technical jargon, and how to simplify it to make sure that our message is coming across correctly. And also, I think that this is something that everyone who has worked in the charity sector or the conservation sector can agree with me, and it's the limited resources. So we sometimes experience budget constraints, funding, lack of in-house skills, time. So these would be the main challenges that we might need to take into account, but obviously we can address them and build positive and inclusive communications through the strategy and for the different materials. Next slide, please. So besides knowing why is it important and the challenges we might face, we also need to know our audiences. This is something that it's very basic in communications when we're developing any strategy, and you might find a difference in between who you're talking with and who do you want to reach or talk to. So things to take into account would be demographic considerations, that everyone knows age, gender, ethnicity, etc. Cultural insights like beliefs and traditions, which might be very important when you're crafting any type of communications. the language, the preferred languages or the preferred dialogue, so then you can actually build compelling and honest stories. The communication preferences, maybe it's digital and maybe your targeted audience is very active on Facebook but not active on LinkedIn, or maybe they are more engaged with email marketing or newsletters and not that much with TikTok. So you need to map where where your audiences are and how they want information to be presented to them. And maybe you find sometimes that when you're working with some communities, they prefer offline channels or classic media channels such as radio or on-site workshops or maybe the local newspaper. So you will need to map this to make sure that you're not just talking to one audience, but you're reaching everyone. Also, some barriers of engagement that people in the field might find, and then they will translate it to you as the communications team, is that they might find barriers of mistrust or historical issues or awareness gap. So I think that part of our responsibility as communicators is to try and be a bridge and be as inclusive and clear and honest about everything and make sure that we take into account their perspectives so we can reach them, build trust, and then also broadcast clear messages that are actually compelling and that are actually telling a true story. Next slide, please. I think that the impact of effective communications is unavoidable, and I think that here everyone would agree with me in saying that to be able to make people care or to be able to care about something, you need to understand it. So this is a big link to what Rachel was mentioning in the introduction. So obviously, what type of impact an effective communication would have? It would increase the community participation and stewardship because they understand what's going on. We ensure an accurate understanding and implementation of the conservation measures. And obviously, these two will end up evolving in an effective promotion and an effective, more global or regional collaboration and knowledge exchange. Next slide, please. So one useful technique that I've used sometimes when crafting the strategy and thinking about like a campaign or a citizen science project or how to build, I don't know, an infographic is the SBI technique, which helps me make sure that I'm trying to take everyone into account while thinking about what's the situation and what are going to be my KPIs. So basically, SBI stands for S, that is the situation. So you would describe a specific situation you need to address. B, which is for behavior. So you would list specific actions that are taken or recommend that you're going to take into account or activate and that are a recommended response to the situation you're facing, and then the impact, which means your KPIs. You would discuss with your team which are your goals and how you're going to measure them to ensure that the strategy you're building makes sense and it's actually effective. I think that the SBI technique can also be applied to shape behavioral change. So this would be a more psychological aspect of a project, but I think that psychology and communications are very interlinked. So this is interesting. You might not want to do it just for communications and marketing, but you might want to use this technique to think outside the box when you're facing a specific project challenge. Next slide, please. So this would be an example of how to apply the SBI framework to conservation and communications. So basically, for example, we can find two issues. Let's say you are trying to communicate marine resources management conservation project, and the community is not resonating with your messaging, and this is causing resistance to accept the measures you're trying to implement. And on the other hand, let's say that your international audience is not understanding what's going on or what you're doing. You're not being very clear, so they also don't connect with the campaign. So then we would sit down and think about what are the recommended actions. So if I want a community to resonate with my communications, we always need to take them into account. And this means we need to study and do some research about culturally relevant languages, arts, media, and engage the local leaders and the local community, and make sure that when we are crafting the storytelling or crafting the illustrations or crafting any visual materials, we are incorporating the traditional knowledge in the messaging. Maybe they have specific traditional art. Maybe they want to frame their stories in a certain way. They will give you also tips on how to do it. And I think that it's very important to be active listeners at this stage. Then when we analyze the outcomes, we would see that by engaging with the community, obviously we will build trust with them. This builds up also cooperation, and this leads to a better community engagement. And by the other hand, if we're being original and creative and we're taking everyone's perspectives and point of views into account, we might be able to build really cool communication materials. And I think that we need to be every time more and more creative to engage international audiences or global audiences. But if we're expressing the storytelling in a if we're expressing the storytelling in a very inclusive way, and we're very clear, we might be able to give external audiences a deeper understanding on what we're doing on the real stories, and we're also fostering border support and awareness. And this can also be positive for any grants or funders or anyone who's supporting who's supporting your project financially, because they want to see what's going on and they want to see clear messages of how the project is being implemented in the region. Next slide, please. So this would be a quick example of how I would strategize building an inclusive communication material, media pack, or whatever. So I would think about the objective, and for example, in this case, the example was, for example, about the benefits of citizens and these activities to empower the community and make them the real stewards, no, of their own resources. So the tactic would be taking into account that I want real stories. I would need to work with the community. So I would ask the people in the field to conduct workshops and community meetings that can be facilitated by bilingual or local facilitators, because sometimes people, as I was mentioning before, feel more comfortable explaining their stories in their own dialects or their own languages. And then this would ensure the understanding and the participation of the community. And once the people in the field come back with this information, or if I'm in the field, I would do this myself, I would think about how to develop the strategy. So For example, taking into account that MarAlliance, we work in Belize and we can find people speaking English, Spanish, Creole, or Garifuna. I would say that developing bilingual educational materials would be a good strategy to get the locals involved in citizen science activities. So I would think about that when I'm designing the posters, the visual field guides, the videos, etc. Also, if you find that you're working in a community that has cultural symbols or cultural art and you want to include them, always try to be respectful and obviously ask what they mean and ask if you can do it or not, but you can also integrate them in your materials. And the desired impact of taking all these little steps into account would be that we would increase the stewardship and the participation in the citizen science activities by the local community. This, obviously, when it comes to the KPIs of the conservation project, it would also have an impact because it would lead to measurable improvements in the conservation of outcomes of the project itself, not just in the communication aspects. Next slide, please. So I think that in the visuals and storytelling are the most important thing. It's been proved that we humans are highly visual animals. So from one side, I would recommend give space for everyone to tell their stories because storytelling makes us engage with emotions and makes information relatable. So some tips I would give you would be highlight local heroes and local success stories, simplify the complex scientific data. Sometimes scientists say we're dumbing down science, but we are not. We're just trying to make everyone be able to understand, and we need to take into account that not everyone has the same education capacities or has had the same possibilities. So we need to ensure that everyone understands what we're talking about. And I would also recommend you to include diverse voices and experiences to make sure everyone feels represented. In terms of visual elements, I am well aware that sometimes we don't have a super high-tech phone or we might not have good cameras. So I would recommend that if you're applying to a grant or a fund and you have the opportunity um, to separate a bit of the budget and invest it in a GoPro 10 or a good camera, I would highly recommend you to do so because grants and funders are wanting more and more visual storytelling, and that's what I've realized. So you need to have the tools to be able to do it. And if not, just try it with your phone, do the best you can. And I think that content sometimes is more important than the actual way or the perfection of the high quality. So if you're crafting interesting content, it's always going to be better than having really cool images and no real message. So I would also encourage you to always incorporate symbols and art to create culturally relevant and relatable content, always asking and being respectful with um, the culture. And I think that infographics are the best thing when we want to do visual storytelling and visual data representation. So I would recommend you to use this as a good way to explain in a clean and very non-complex and accessible way of, sorry, in a very clean and clear, it's a very clean and clear way of expressing and informing the communities and the different audiences you have. Next slide, please. So I think that communications and marketing, sometimes people might think it's just to promote your project or look cool on Instagram. And I think that we should be able to reflect on the idea that communications in conservation is essential for raising awareness, changing, promoting behavioral change, influencing the public opinion. It also advocates for policies, and it also addresses conflict. So we shouldn't think that communications and marketing is just to sell the project or sell a product, but it encompasses a lot of different moving parts that any project needs to take into account. Now that I've explained you a little bit of the theory, I'm going to expose a couple of campaigns I've co-managed and another one that I think that it's a good example, so we can share a more practical approach to everything that we've been mentioning so far. So next slide, please. The first campaign I want to introduce you is the campaign I co-managed while I was working at BirdLife International. This campaign was a coalition in between BirdLife, SEO BirdLife, and the UN. And then we built a very big coalition with more than 120 partners from all over the world. We were pushing the the idea of living on a healthy planet as a new human right. And from a communications perspective, what we did was what I'm going to explain here now. So our approach was we have many different partners from many different sides of the world with different levels of in-house skills and technology. So we did a multilingual digital campaign, and the campaign included social media materials, infographics, website widgets, and content. And we wanted to ensure that partners had accessibility to absolutely everything. So what we did was when we were tailoring the different materials, we took into account regional adaptations. So we did country-specific media packs. For example, here you can see the toucan one. This was for the LATAM partners. So we took into account local biodiversity, symbols, traditional knowledge, and cultural references to make the call to action more appealing to the audiences we were targeting. So for example, I think that in Asia, from the top of my head, we used helmeted hornbills, and in Africa, we used some species of vultures. So we wanted not to integrate this local biodiversity so people felt engaged with what we were asking for. Then when it came to digital engagement, this campaign started while we were still in COVID. So we did targeted webinars, virtual events, and virtual workshops and trainings to engage stakeholders globally. And also when we were able to, we started doing more grassroots mobilizations and community involvement. So we organized workshops with the community leaders. We did local events, citizens and science initiatives. So we tried to take into account everyone everywhere. And I think this has been the biggest international campaign I've been involved in. Next slide, please. Another example was I co-managed the CNN Call to Earth episode, Protecting Nature's Highways. This was an initiative led by BirdLife International, and we as MarAlliance were part of it with a little part of the episode that was aimed to explain how our work it's been done throughout the Mesoamerican reef and the Mesoamerican region, and how we collaborate with the local fishers and the local stakeholders. So in terms of communications, one highlight that I think that fits into this presentation is that we had to do many interviews to the different team members and some of the fishermen, they felt way more comfortable talking in their native languages, as I mentioned before. They speak Spanish, English, Garifuna, and Creole. I don't speak Garifuna and Creole, so I had to ask a team member to help me translate everything so I could provide the CNN with the materials. But I really wanted them to be able to talk in their own languages and dialects because I wanted them to share their personal stories in an honest and authentic way. And I think this was a success. The communications materials, as this was CNN, we had a multi-channel approach. There was a podcast, there were videos, social media snippets, there was an article published. But obviously, the guys of the team, this wasn't built for them. It was for an international audience. So what I did was downloading the video, translating the article, and building a media pack for them and sending it through WhatsApp because we have our WhatsApp working group to ensure that they could also see the impact of what they're doing and how it's being promoted in a wider scope. So they felt super proud. They shared through their Facebook. We considered as MarAlliance to share the snippets and give them the little highlights on the stories and social media so they could also share it. Because sometimes when we do very big things, we might forget to look at the local impact or the regional impact. And I think that we always need to take everyone into account. Next slide, please. And this last example is the Xingu Indigenous Park in Brazil. This is a campaign and a project that it's done by the Instituto Socioambiental y Amazon Watch. I don't know if anyone knows it, but I think it's a great example in terms of communications and marketing and being inclusive. So basically, the aim was to protect large areas of the Amazon rainforest within the Xingu Indigenous Territory to help both preserve the biodiversity and the traditional ways of life of numerous indigenous communities. So in terms of communications, what they did was including a lot of visual storytelling through videos, photography, and art, utilizing the languages and symbols familiar to all these indigenous communities. They even teach them how to use the cameras, the microphones, and to how to record each other to explain their stories. And they also created traditional songs based on traditional knowledge and narratives that conveyed messages about conservation and their cultural heritage. And also they even filmed a movie. In communications materials, I think that one highlight was the blend of the traditional art forms with the modern digital media. This little social media post that you can see in the right is a quote from a cacique or a group leader from one of the indigenous communities. And I think that this not only preserves cultural heritage, but also makes the content engaging for global audiences that might not be connected or might not even know what's going on. Next slide, please. So in terms of tools and resources, I wanted to share some of my go-tos and the tools that I think that are very useful, taking into account that we might not have a very big team or we might not speak all the languages in the world. So in terms of languages challenges and translations, I feel that Google Translate is getting better and better with all the AI optimizations. And also DeepL is a very, very good online translator. They are both free, so I think that it's a very useful resource. When it comes to designing templates, designing banners, booklets, infographics, my tool of reference is Canva. I think that maybe some of the people that are here in the webinar, we all panicked when we had to learn all the Adobe suite and how Photoshop worked and how Illustrator worked, and now Canva is just the best thing ever. If you are working for a charity, Canva also has discounts for charity, so you can apply to the charity discount and you'll get the Canva Pro version for your charity. When it comes to project management, I would say that the tools I prefer personally are Trello and Monday.com. Trello is very visual, it's very user friendly, and everyone can be interconnected. You can upload arts, PDFs, documents, links. So I think it's very cool when you're trying to build a media pack, for example, and want to share it to different partners or to different people. Trello has a nice presentation. And then Monday.com is more project management. You can develop different dashboards. You can work in a traffic light type of way. So it's red, yellow, and green, and you can mark with your colleagues how the different actions are evolving. But I find it quite useful, and you can also upload documents, pictures, manage anything you need from there. When it comes to visuals, I think that if anyone here works in comms, I bet that you had challenges finding videos and images that are sharp and high quality and can be used. I would say Pexels is a great tool. It has both video and image that are free to use. I would always recommend credit the authors. If people are being nice enough to share their videos and images with us, I think that they deserve the credit. And it's a great tool. And then I would encourage everyone, if you haven't done it yet, to test ChatGPT. It's like having an assistant, and it can be very helpful when it comes to grammar and spell check. If you need to create a script and you want for it to be organized in a different way, or you want to do some brainstorming, I think it's like magic. So it's also a tool I would highly recommend to everyone. I'm doing these recommendations taking into account that I've worked for many years in a single person communications team. So you always need to be resourceful and think outside the box. So I hope that these tools also help everyone here. Next slide, please. And I would need to wrap it up with one of my favorite quotes. I think that as communicators, we have a responsibility to, yes, to help everyone understand what's happening. And this quote of Jacques Cousteau that says that people protect what they love, and they love what they understand, and they understand what they are taught. It's part of our responsibility to broadcast honest and inclusive messages anytime, everywhere, and for everyone. So next slide. I would like to open the Q&A session. I hope this has been interesting and helpful for everyone. And you can also contact me on my email or by following MarAlliance or following myself on LinkedIn or Instagram. So yes, let's see what people want to ask me.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much, and sorry for some technical glitches. So now we have question and answer session, but before that, John would like to share about Conservation Optimism Summit.
Thank you, Rashu. Just a quick announcement while everybody's on here, and then we can get on with the interesting stuff. Not that the summit isn't interesting, but I want to get into this Q&A. But just to remind you all, if you haven't seen the emails that I've been trying to send to everybody on the planet, but in September we are hosting a Conservation Optimism Summit here at Oxford, but also online. We're using the Hoover platform to try and make sure that people who are watching online have a similar experience to people who are actually here in Oxford as well. It's 2.5 days of conservationists from all over the world. We've called it empowering, enabling, and embracing. And it's a good chunk. It's not really an academic summit. There's a little bit of academic summit in there, but it's really about sharing inspiration and stories of success in conservation. It's about learning new skills. So we've set it up not with little talks, but with longer workshops. And we've got people like Extinction Rebellion coming to talk to us about how to get involved in activism. And we've got the Agile people here from Oxford who are going to teach us all about how to engage better in policy. And move fast on working with government to shape policy. We've got people coming from all over the place, and they are sharing what they know rather than just giving a talk on this is what I've done in the last year. There's also, because we're conservationists working with enormous challenges, a big chunk of health and well-being and community building and looking after each other. And so essentially it's an enormous 3-day hug for conservationists all over the world. Come and feel empowered, come and learn new things, and come and get a bit of sanity at the same time and a bit of community with fellow conservationists. The online tickets are only £30 if you've got some money, and if you're in a low income or middle income country, they're free, which is just brilliant because we've got a lot of content here. If you can come to Oxford, come to Oxford. We'd love to see you. It's going to be exciting, I think. We'd love to encourage as many of you as we can to be part of it. That's my advert break over. And now back to the main program.
Thank you, John. So I can already see some questions coming on the chat. You can also ask questions directly by raising your hand, but let's first address these questions. There is one question on the chat from Aditi Rajan. Maria, can you see that?
Okay.
Yeah.
So the question, what has been your experience measuring impact of these campaigns? Were there certain methods you used to quantify what on-ground effect changes in behavior these resulted in? Okay. So this is a tricky question because communications is not like we don't have like one recipe fits all. So you just need to test constantly. I would say that we can, my experience in measuring impact has been online and offline. When it comes to online, you just choose the KPIs and avoid vanity metrics and really see what's working and what's not working. And your question is measuring the ground effect and changes. I would say that grassroots and like local on-ground effects take sometimes years to be able to be seen, because when you work with communities, you need to build relationships with people, and then you need to build trust. And for example, at MarAlliance, we've been working with fishermen for 14 years now, or even more, and they are the ones that now bring new fishers to the project. So you can clearly see that there has been a behavioral change and that they understand the importance of protecting these species and working in conservation. So it depends on what type of campaign you're doing and if you have any deadlines. But I would say that if it's digital, choose real metrics that also allow you to change the strategy you're following if they're not what you expect. For example, maybe you can monitor the engagement on the articles on the website. You can see how many times a post has been shared or has been saved. Likes is a vanity metric, for example, and it won't help you measure any like real impact. And when it comes to quantifying ground effect, you can see the attendance in the workshops. You can quantify the people that want to participate in your projects, in the open calls, in the citizen science activities, the people that come to volunteer. So that's why I was saying that sometimes on ground, it takes a bit longer because you're building relationship with people. And when it comes to digital, everything is super fast paced and you have very clear ways of measuring and quantifying what's going on. I don't know if this answers your question, Aditi.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, that helps. And yeah, measuring impact is always tricky business, especially on field, because we work with a lot of local communities. So you never really know. And yeah, I think we try online as well, but then what do the numbers really mean anything is something we struggle with as well. But yeah, it's good to hear, and that really helps. So thank you so much for answering and sharing.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Aditi, for your question, and thank you, Maria. So there is another question from Grace.
Grace. Okay, so working in a nonprofit in diverse parts of the US, we have one of the largest growing populations of new Americans with limited resources. How do we prioritize which languages, cultures to market to for our conservation efforts without causing tension in the community? In school district alone, there are 32 languages spoken. Okay, so what I would recommend is, as I was saying and mentioning on the presentation, try to engage different groups and try to do community surveys. It's always very tricky. It's always a challenge, but I think that the best way for it to be addressed is to start if there's a language that is spoken by the majority of the community, or if you host a workshop or a presentation of the project with community leaders and involving facilitators, so you avoid what you were mentioning of tension in the community, and ensure that you have a short-term, mid-term, and long-term plan where you will be inclusive in all the stages of the project. So it also depends, Grace, on who you want to explain this to, because if you are creating materials for the community, then you will need to take into account these different languages that are spoken by them. But if you want to get funding for the project, then you need to see what languages your desired audiences are speaking to connect with them, get them hooked, and then get them involved. I would say that the first thing to do is just getting everyone involved, planning a short, mid, long-term communication strategy, and starting by what you can cover, and then trying to see if there's volunteers that can help you translate in different languages, if there's team members that speak different languages that can also support. What I've realized is that being inclusive takes a lot of time and effort, because you're always translating and just like trying to find people that can support. So that would be my recommendation: having a clear strategy, being very honest, and explaining to everyone that you don't have all the resources, but you're going to do your best to try and be as inclusive as possible. Find volunteers that help you translate in different languages, and follow the strategy with facilitators that support you to alleviate these tensions that might occur if you pick one language before another one. I hope this is useful. Grace.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Grace, for this question. There is one question for John regarding Conservation Optimism Summit.
I did already answer that privately, but just to let everybody know, if anybody's interested in volunteering for the summit in any way, if you can drop me an email, I'm at John, which is JON, at conservationoptimism.org. So it's quite an easy email address. It's just John, JON, at conservationoptimism.org. And let me know what you'd like to do and how you can get involved, where you are, what's possible. We can't guarantee it, but we'll see if anything's possible. We'd love to get as many people involved as possible. While I've got the microphone on, can I ask a question, Rashu?
Yes.
I know it's being sneaky, but I'm going to try and sneak a question in. But that was brilliant, Mireia. And there's being sensitive to local cultures and being aware of local cultures. As any communicator, you need to know your audience really well. But there's also a culture sometimes between the communicator and the community. I'm thinking there's a cultural context there sometimes as well. If we're talking to people in our own countries, then we're the scientists, we're the conservationists, they are not, and we're just trying to say, you should be aware of this. It'd be great if you could stick solar panels on your roof, swap your 4x4 for an electric bicycle, whatever. But if you're talking to people in Belize, or I'm British, our ancestors may have been responsible for a teeny tiny bit of colonialization around the world. And that brings in a whole other element. And how do we make sure that the same as we're in our own countries, we're talking to people as we're scientists, we're conservationists, we want to talk to you about whatever this habitat is, rather than we're British, we're Spanish, we're Western European, and we're turning up in your country and telling you stuff. How do we balance that culture as well as the local culture?
I think that to avoid the old Western conservation approach, we need to learn how to listen, because we didn't listen that much when we went there, and sometimes when we go there. So basically, it's being an active listener and asking what worries them, what are their concerns. And I think that this can be extrapolated to when you're trying to explain people about solar panels, or when we are going to other countries where we might find more resistance in communicating with the community. So we just need to shut up and listen and see what they want, how they would feel respected, and also trust builds cooperation. But it happens if you don't understand what's going on from their perspective. At least from MarAlliance, the guys are hands and eyes in the sea. So obviously, if I don't listen to them, then who am I not going to listen? And I think that we need to be less self-centric and more community-centric, because at the end of the day, we work in conservation, and conservation shouldn't have barriers, and conservation is bigger than everyone and our own charities and our own projects, and we're all working for a larger goal. So I think that inclusivity means being a very good active listener.
I'm glad we recorded that answer, because I thought it was brilliant.
Thank you, John.
So we have less than 5 minutes left, but we have like 3 questions. I think, Mireia, you can answer them quickly.
Sure. Let me see if I can find them in the chat. So Bill
from
How can
Bill.
we raise consciousness about biodiversity the way consciousness has already been raised? And bring, okay, so how can we raise consciousness about biodiversity the way consciousness has already been raised about climate change and bringing more people to support our causes? I think, well, as I was saying, there's no magic formula. And if you at some point will know the answer for this, I would love to hear it too. From my perspective, what I would say is uh, I think that people need to understand that biodiversity loss affects our health, affects us all. Sometimes we are so alienated from nature, we don't feel we're part of nature, that the loss of the macaws in I don't know where, or the loss of yellowfin tuna populations in a place, in another place, just feels so disconnected from our own reality that why should we care? No, I don't know. I haven't seen a macaw in my life. So I think that what has worked for me, at least, is to explain the link in between us, which we are egocentric animals, and nature itself. Because we have been so dissociated from nature that now I think that one of the main challenges as communicators is to build this bridge again and to fill this gap. And I think that people care about climate change because climate change affects your health. And it's very clear. The messaging is very, very clear. So I would try and see if, I don't know what project you're working in, but I would try and through research, there must be data that explains how its biodiversity loss is linked to our health, to our mental health, physical health, and try and build a narrative from there. That would be my 5 cents on this one. Then the next, sorry, I hope this answers the question. I don't know if we want to keep talking about this. The next question would be, how correct and incorrect is to communicate with technical language and detailed metrics? Often donors need the info, but general population not necessarily. Infographics, data visualization. So we need to find highlights. So what works, at least from me, with my science team is they send me the paper and they send me the summary and it's like, okay, give me 5 bullet points with 5 highlights that are extremely interesting or that are extremely important. And I'll be the one that wraps them up and presents them in a nice way that it's compelling. But I would say try to find the sweet spot. I don't know what your project is about, and if you have like very heavy data. Donors are always interested in metrics because it means something is working or not working. But I do agree that the population not necessarily needs so much data or so many numbers. So I would say detailed metrics are useful, but always try to explain them in a simplified manner if you want to be educational and reach a wider public. The next question.
Maria, before going to next question, is it okay to share your slides to participants because there are some questions on that?
Sure. Yes, it's perfectly fine. You can all use the slides.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, I lost it. The next question will be, how can we better capture, encourage local communities' interest in protecting endangered species, especially as they are a foodstuff? Okay, so I would assume we're talking about endangered species that are commercially used in the regions where we work. So I think that this is a very delicate issue because, as we were talking with John, we need to avoid having this old Western approach of we are going to tell you this shouldn't be done because this is endangered and it's maybe the only way of life they know. So I think that one, economic diversification, showing teaching communities about the long-term impact of unsustainable practices and how this will affect the species they're commercializing would be also a good idea in some countries. And there's this economic diversification to tourism, for example, always trying to be sustainable and always trying to be like data oriented. So I would say that the best way from a communications perspective is to explain the economical effects of the bad resource management. So you explain them this. And for example, I was involved when I was living in the Galapagos Island in a PhD that was comparing the how tourists and how locals saw sharks. So locals saw them as an economical resource for their fins, their meat, etc. And tourists obviously came to the Galapagos Islands to see the sharks. So we did infographics explaining the impact of shark finning in the populations and how that would diminish their incomes and their food stuff, as you were mentioning. And also we did from another side a comparison on how much a shark was worth in the tourism industry and the different ways they could get involved. You always also need to have a good network that will support them to develop these different activities. You can just tell them what to do and then just leave it for them to develop it.
There is one more question from Isa.
From Isa, see. Okay. I'm interested to know how can we effectively translate what we've learned, be active listeners, and take what we've learned from communicating with local and diverse populations to integrate it into our society. I was recently introduced to the field of nature solutions to climate change. Indigenous populations often have better knowledge of the environment and live far more sustainably. Mireia mentioned a project working with indigenous communities. I would be interested in know if anyone here has experience using what they've learned from their custodianship of the environment that we could utilize to make work and lifestyle like mine more sustainable. Wow, this is this is almost a philosophical question. So from my perspective, I've worked with indigenous communities in Ecuador, Panama, the fishermen from Belize, from the Galapagos Islands. I've worked with fishermen in Mexico. They're not indigenous, but their lifestyle couldn't be more distant from our lifestyle. And what I've learned is that, and it sounds like I assume everyone says it, but we don't need so many things. Sometimes you're just stressed, and going outside to nature and just realizing you're part of a whole and that's what you're working to protect makes a huge difference. So I would say they teach you to be humble, and I think that being humble changes the way you relate with others and the way you relate with nature. So that would be my main take, because they feel part of it. So when they're the guardians of a species or their custodianship, as you were saying, of their land, they don't feel better than animals and trees, and they don't feel over wildlife, and they just feel part of it. So being humble is part of what I would say one of the biggest behavioral changes that can help you change a little bit this Western approach we have to life. That would be my, but this is a very interesting and philosophical question. I don't know if my answer was deep enough.
Thank you, Isa, for your question, and thank you, Maria. So I think we are good to wrap up now. Thank you, Maria, for this really insightful webinar, and thank you everyone for joining and asking really amazing questions. So please feel free to give your feedback, and we will share Maria's slide as soon as we can. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks, everyone. See you at the summit in September.